Okay, I'm back. Hopefully the viewer out there who left the comments on the last video, hopefully you're still around. If you are, feel free to send me a message. Um, but in my last video where I was going through sort of the history of psychology and sort of different use cases and ways to use this typology stuff, somebody in the chat left a question, which I think actually ties pretty nicely to all this stuff, and might help flesh out some of the points I was trying to make in the previous video. But they asked, what are my thoughts on the various models that you see out there in the typology world, sort of the big ones sort of floating around on the internet. And they asked specifically, um, my thoughts on the different approaches or different models, namely the talking with famous people, the objective personality, or the super Dave Powers for those old school people who remember those days. And I think maybe CS Joseph. And so, and I think again, this is a good way to sort of getting into the different approaches, because I think each of them approach this whole stuff, all of this stuff differently. Okay. Now, before I get into this, I'm going to put some disclaimers out there first. First of all, I've got no dog in this fight. I'd like to be a completely objective observer. I'm going to use my INFJ FE defense mechanism of trying to ward off any sort of personal attacks or anything by just prefacing, I don't have a dog in this fight. These views are just completely what I think. I realize there's a lot of, back and forth in various camps out there. And so I'm certainly not trying to wage in any sort of internet battle or even really take a stance on it and on anything. And I understand that's somewhat intellectually dishonest of me, but I'm going to try to be a little bit of an outside observer. But, reading between the lines, you'll probably see where I come out on a lot of this. And I will point out that, hey, I'm willing to be persuaded otherwise to the extent that I do have a personal opinion on any of this stuff. Okay. All right. So the three different sort of models going out there, I actually think actually tie in pretty well to three different approaches or sort of eras or movements in psychology in general, right? So first one I'll start off with is, and I'm going to just sort of go back and forth and interweave all this stuff. I don't have anything like planned out on this. The question just came up. So these are my random thoughts. So the first model would be talking with famous people, which I'm probably the most intimately familiar with. And it's roughly a extension of the socionics model and the MBTI model. But because Eric, the host of the channel, is he's an ENTP and he's got his TI, working full force on it. He's got his own structure that that is loosely based on socionics, but he's sort of refined. Refined is the word I'm looking for, right? So he's refined the model into a way that he thinks makes sense to him. Again, I'm probably most partial to that, mainly because, well, there's lots of different reasons, but he sort of is taking the approach that I think I take, just from a general sense of discovery, right? He just wants to know how this stuff works. my vibe, right? And figuring out how it works, and then figuring out a way to explain it to where he can get other people to sort of buy into his model. And it's a very intellectual exercise for him, and I think a very academic one. Now, to the extent there's any sort of real world application to it, I think it's mostly just trying to help people figure out what precisely their type is, under his model, and you know but he doesn't really come across as trying to do any sort of self-help, or he's not like a self-help guru where it's like this sort of therapeutic kind of endeavor, right? It's more of just like, hey, here's your type, here's the model, here's how everything sort of lays out, and take from it what you will, right? Every once in a while, he might have some recommendations on how it is to be a certain type, and what works for people and what doesn't work for people. But that isn't really, I think, his ultimate goal. I think it really is just sort of discovery. Like, how do we categorize this stuff? What's the taxonomy of it, in the way that I would say, sort of an astrophysicist wants to understand, what makes up the different planets, what's their atmosphere, what sort of, elements and molecules and all that kind of stuff make them up, and how does gravity work and all that. Not in any sort of applied way, but just, this is it. This is how it works. So that is one of the reasons that I tend to buy into it, because his focus is on sort of precision and, I guess, for lack of a better term, just sort of being right about it, right? Like having a what he calls a defensible model, that sort of, stands up to sort of logical scrutiny. And to me, that's just sort of the fun part of it, right? Like just figuring out how all this stuff works, like opening up a watch and trying to figure out how that works. Okay. The next one would be the objective personality, the Dave and Shannon one. Pretty sure it's Shannon, right? So I gotta admit, when I first started getting into this, Dave's Superpowers had an old channel, and I don't know if those videos are still up, but I gotta admit, like, that was one of my first windows into all of this stuff. Now I studied it somewhat in undergrad and grad school, but like I've talked about before, most of the personality research, in academia, is largely based off of the Oceans model. And so I was familiar with that, to some extent, somewhat familiar with the MBTI, but my real understanding of it, came from watching a lot of his videos. There was another guy around at the time, and I don't know what's happened to him. I don't think he's posted in a long time, or unless he's got a different channel. And that was the NF Geeks channel. And that was a guy who was like an actual MBTI practitioner, and I think he was a professor somewhere. And he had, a lot of interesting takes. And his channel was probably a lot more like mine, where it was just sort of anecdotes about, here's how the different personalities interact, and here's, how personalities sort of think about different situations like love or Valentine's Day or Christmas. And it's just sort of like I don't know, just kind of like a Sunday afternoon conversation, like a lifestyle kind of view of it. And he wasn't really trying to persuade anybody or make any theoretical technical arguments. Oh, hey, okay, so the viewer's back. And he wasn't trying to make any like academic discoveries or anything. He was just sort of taking MBTI at its face value and just sort of talking about, hey, how do different types think about different things? And to me, that gave a really good background as well. So back to Dave's superpowers. Those were sort of my two windows into all this stuff. And the Dave superpowers was much more about, sort of answering questions and again, more about trying to like zero in on how does all this stuff work and how to explain it and the mechanics of it, right? As opposed to NF Geeks was just sort of like, hey, here's sort of a lifestyle account of how this stuff sort of unfolds in everyday life. Dave's superpowers is much more about explaining, like, okay, here's the mechanics of it, and here's how it works. And then, so he had a bunch of videos, and some of them, were, I don't want to say right versus wrong, but some had things that I might disagree with, some things I totally agreed with. But he had a very systematic approach of it, and I would argue he is much more in sort of the applied camp, right? And he even has mentioned that the whole reason he got into this stuff is he owned a small business and he just wanted to figure out like how to interact with his customers, and he sort of saw that different customers would ask different types of questions and want different types of responses. And in that sense, it's very similar to how I use it, where, just how do you use this stuff in real world, practical, pragmatic ways in interacting with people. Okay, and then he sort of disappeared, and then he came back with the objective personality system. Okay, and so here are my thoughts on that. And I will acknowledge, I did do a typing session with them like really early on when they first started the website. I think, one of the first people that submitted something. I remember when the website wasn't even up and they just sort of had an announcement that it was coming, and I signed up for an email to alert me when it went live. And then as soon as it went live, I, put in my sort of application to be typed or whatever. And so they typed me very early on. And then I also, signed up for the class and did the class. And again, it was just sort of an intellectual endeavor. I think Dave and Shannon are really funny. I like watching them. I like the way they interact with each other. I like Dave's anecdotes. I like the way he sort of explains things in sort of a very NI way, like, here's such and such in a nutshell kind of way. And I even did the class mainly just so that I'd have access to the videos and just sort of watch the way they typed it. I wasn't really planning on doing anything more with it other than just really for sort of entertainment / educational use, right? But what I slowly sort of, or eventually sort of realized, is that the model just became too unwieldy, I think. There's something, and I will admit, it's been years since I've, watched it or, sort of watched it, any other videos, or was sort of actively involved with it. And so they might have refined things or changed things, since then. So to the extent I say anything that's sort of outdated or no longer applies, I apologize. But at the time, my reaction was, it's just too unwieldy, especially for something that I think is intended to be applied, right? I don't know for sure, but I think what their intention is to develop this model that they can use as sort of in the same way that MBTI uses its model in a very business oriented, entrepreneurial kind of money making way, right? Like they can go to the Amazons and the Netflixes and various companies like that and say, look, we've got this personality model with a bunch of data that it supports it, and we can help you identify the personality types of your customers or your viewers, that kind of thing, to sort of help with your algorithm, that kind of stuff. Because all that big data algorithm stuff was coming out around that time. And I think Dave's a very entrepreneurial type of guy, and I think he realized that he could be sitting on a gold mine there. So I don't know what's ultimately happened, if that's worked out, but hopefully it works. But as far as my specific criticisms of the model, again, it's boils down to 512 different personality types, which to me reminds me of the old Stephen Wright joke where he said he bought a life-size map of the United States. He's like, this thing's impossible to fold. And the point being, if you come up with a model to sort of describe a natural phenomenon, some sort of scientific model, you can't just explain, like, it's got to reduce into some subcomponents, right? That isn't just sort of mapping everything as is, right? So take, for example, biology, right? We separate vertebrates from invertebrates, and we separate insects from mammals, and we separate birds from rodents, and we have all these different ways of classifying things, but there is some sort of unifying factor in each of the classifications, right? Like, biology wouldn't make any sense if we just if every insect and every animal and every bird and every plant and every sponge and that kind of stuff, invertebrate, had its own classification, right? Like, there would be no point in biology. There would be no point in classification. And I think a model that comes out with 512 different personality types, where it's almost impossible to just see one person and say, okay, they are a number 423 and they are a 371. Like, how do you do that? Like, what's the point of having a model that has that many classification schemes? Now, they might push back, and if I were taking their side on it, I might argue, well, this is all big data, and we're trying to be as precise as possible so that the data sort of aligns as precisely as possible for its use case, right? So if Netflix is trying to use all this data, then the more tags it has, the more precise it can be to making recommendations and things like that. It's like, okay, so fair enough, right? So I do understand why you might do it that way, because if you go to Netflix and just say, hey, look, I've got 4 different personality types, and you can make recommendations off of these 4 types, they might say, well, that doesn't really narrow it down enough for us where anybody gets sort of an individualized experience from our product, right? And so 4 would be too few, 16 might be too few, 32 even might be too few, right? Because again, Amazon and Netflix want an individualized experience for you, right? And if they lump you into one of 4 types, that's not so individualized, right? So I can see why they would take that approach and try to have as many categories as possible to sort of make the data precise. So I don't want to completely, poo-poo their model, because I understand where they might be coming from. Now, they've never told me this, and I've never heard them say it that way. But if I had to sort of defend them, that's the argument I would make. Okay, but I do think because of it, it's almost impossible for. And let me back up here for those who might not be familiar with sort of their model and the way they do things. So it's loosely based off of the MBTI. They use MBTI nomenclature and terminology, but they do a whole lot of changes to it. And I almost think that they'd be better off if they just got rid of the MBTI tags, like, an INTJ, and just came up with their own descriptions and their own tags. I think it would be a lot more palatable in the overall community, because, they have this whole thing where, like, you're an ENTP and you get these different cognitive functions, but instead of using your first and second, you're a quote unquote jumper, and you use your first and your third. And it's like, well, okay, well, how does that all work? And then there's, whether or not you have sort of a male force versus a female force, in different categories. And there's two male forces and two female forces. And then once you get to the MBTI letters, there's a whole lot of skipping and jumping and things like that. And I'm sure it works in their head, and they, claim that it's quote unquote objective. But what they were trying to do, at least initially, again, I don't know if they're still doing this, but is to basically train everybody on their model and how to basically review videos that people submit answering various questions and come up with a type for them that falls into one of these 512 categories, right? And their argument was that this is quote unquote objective because different people would come to the same conclusion as long as they follow the prescripted process, right? And it's objective in the sense that everybody in the world, as long as they're doing it the right way, everybody in the world will agree that this is, this person is a 422 or this person's a 333 in their system. And they argue that's objective, but of course, the immediate sort of argument is, well, it's still subjective to the person doing the testing, right? Like, they have to come up with some subjective response or observation of whether or not this person's a sensor versus intuitor, or a thinker versus a feeler. Now, yes, they're supposed to follow sort of this recipe to come up with that answer, but each step sort of just requires the person to make sort of a subjective evaluation of it. And the only way that it's really objective is in the sense that, if everybody agrees that, this is the case, then it must be objective. But I think I can't imagine that they've been able to get everybody to sort of agree for every step along the way. Now, the two of them, because they, sort of see things the same way, and they've sort of talked to each other about it over the years and sort of hashed all that stuff out, the two of them might come to the same conclusion more often than not. And, that's great. But I saw one commenter make an analogy that I thought was really good. And it's basically like, if I'm wearing a blue sweater, but the two of you both agree that it's a red sweater, that doesn't objectively make my sweater red. It just means that the two of you agreed that it's a red sweater, right? So is that really objective? In the sense that, we're figuring out what's true in the outside world, independent of the observer, right? Objective should be independent of the observer. And so, my argument has always been, like, if you really want to come up with an objective way, figure out some AI model that basically will, transcribe what the person responds, and, figure out some way of figuring, like, do their verbal patterns come out as intuitive versus sensor? Like, for example, how many analogies do they make? How many metaphors do they make? Or how many words do they use when they're describing a sensory experience, right? And then finding some way to use that verbal AI sort of, reading of the text to correlate to the different types. And then it doesn't matter whether the person's really an INTP or an ESTP. It's just using this model. Like, this type of person uses a lot of words when they're describing a sensory experience, as opposed to a different type of person. Or this type of person uses a lot of, emotional language when describing a particular phenomenon versus somebody else who uses different language. But it's something that is very objective, right? And you get other people out there who try to like track eye movements or micro expressions on the face. And I mean, I give them all the credit, but I have yet to see anything like definitive come out of that, other than just sort of a subjective interpretation. But if you come up with like a model that reads everybody's eye movements or micro expressions or their use of language in a transcript, and it reliably predicts not necessarily what MBTI type is, but you can reliably sort them into different categories, then great, go for it. That's probably what the Amazons and the Netflix of the world are looking for. But to the extent that you make your assessments along the way on subjective interpretations, like, this person seems to be talking about a lot of facts, and so I'm going to make them a thinker or a sensor or whatever, versus something else. And again, the other problem, like I said in my other video the other day, is you have to think about the context, right? Just because somebody's spitting out a bunch of SI facts in any particular video doesn't necessarily mean that they're a dominant SI or auxiliary SI or an S in the MBTI nomenclature. It just means that that's how they react to that particular question, right? And what you really have to pay attention to is, how long they can do it and how flexibly they can use that information. And I will be the first to admit that's a subjective observation, right? And even if you're trained and have some sort of certification and all this stuff, you're still ultimately making a subjective determination, even if it's a very well-educated determination and it aligns with what other people conclude. That doesn't make it objective. It is still subjective. Now, but again, if you come up with some computer program and use, randomized double-blind testing, and that was the other thing that bothered me, is he would argue that it's double-blind tested, but it's not. He just sort of has a misinterpretation of what double-blind testing is, or sort of trying to apply it in a loose way. But if you come up with a computer model that reads what people are saying and looks at sort of their hand movements or affect or whatever, and it can reliably put people into categories, whether that matches up with MBTI or some other model, then great, go for it. But that is really the only way I'm going to really buy into a quote unquote objective model. Okay, so that's my criticism there. But that being said, I am a big fan of Dave and Shannon's. I think they are very insightful. I think they do give a lot of insightful analysis and just general observations about the different types, and I did learn a lot from them. I just think that particular model is just too unwieldy to function in the way that they intend for it to. Now, again, maybe they've restructured it and they're doing it a different way, and that's great. I wish them all the luck in the world. Okay. But I also think that people who sort of subscribed to that model just get, their brains just sort of turn into a pretzel. And, and it's really probably just like the INTJs and the INFJs who have this like introverted, intuitive sense of it. And then, of course, they just think they're right. But your average person is probably not going to be able to sort of pick up on the nuances, I think. But then you get like the INTJs and INFJs who think they're right all the time because of that dominant introverted intuition, and they're just going to be battling at it. And then you get the INTPs and the ENTPs swooping in and completely deconstructing it on a TI level. And it just, again, I was following the various groups and everything, and it got too much. Like, people just, for something that was supposed to be objective in the way that we all agree how many, what the planets are in the solar system, except for Pluto, or how gravity works, or things like that, or what's the temperature at which water boils, like just hardcore facts that we can all agree on. I just don't see that happening in their model, unless they do a lot more tinkering with it and get rid of the subjective evaluation element, because otherwise it's just going to be discourse in the same way that all of this stuff is. Okay. Then the last one was this, what is it, C.S. Joseph. I admit I really don't watch his videos. I don't know much about his channel. I've seen a few of them. I've definitely seen Talking with Famous People videos about him. In his channel, he comes across as one of the 1970s transcendental existential types, where it's about self-help, self-actualization, sort of a personal growth guru type. And that's fine, if people are getting something out of it. I could be wrong, but I think he bases his approach or his model on the John Beebe approach, which is roughly the Jungian approach, and trying to tie different archetypes to the different functions. I don't don't waste your time with CSJ. Yeah, okay. So I can't really criticize his methodology. I know the BB model. I tend to agree with it to an intellectual extent. I think it can be refined, it can be sort of tinkered with, but I do, it's fun to use as sort of rough analogies, right? When you're trying to talk about the second function or the third function, to kind of use, the parent or the child is sort of a rough analogy. But again, that, they're using these sort of, non-precise models is sort of a self-help kind of thing, like work on your inferior functions or shadow functions, or at least that's my read of it. I could be wrong. And that's fine. From what I understand, from what other people have mentioned, he doesn't seem to have a very precise way of figuring out the type, So on the one end, you have Talking with Famous People, who I think has a very precise way, and I will fully admit it is subject to his own personal subjective evaluation of the different functions and where they are in a person's type, and understanding, whether the answers that people are giving him and all that kind of stuff. He is making subjective evaluations. But that being said, I think he does a very good job of it. Maybe he's wrong, maybe he's right every once in a while, but he will be the first, to admit that, it's not like he's relying on some mathematical computer-based program on, that's based off of language or stuff like that. Maybe he'll argue his brain does that better than any computer can do it, and he might have a point. But he's at least got some systematic way of doing it that tries to be as precise as possible. Again, objective personality, I think they try, but they are sort of inherently limited in having lots of people doing it and relying on the subjective evaluations that just leads to a lot of what we would call variance or degrees of freedom in your statistics, and that's just, you're never going to get a precise model out of that. Where the C.S. Josephs and a lot of other typology people in the world that are just sort of using it as sort of a self-help thing, I think that's okay. Uh, I have some ethical issues with it, where but in the same way that I have ethical issues with like the DSM that professional certified licensed psychologists and psychiatrists use, where a lot of it is just sort of subjective. But if you get the subjective part wrong, you could be doing more harm than good to the person. Um, and and if you're trying to sell yourself as a self-help guru, and and it's sort of based off of a diagnosis, for lack of a better term, of somebody, right? Like you are an ISTJ or you are an ESFP, and so therefore my prescription for you, as a self-help guru, is to work on this function and do this kind of stuff. Now, if you're wrong, in your initial quote unquote assessment or diagnosis of their type, you could be doing more harm than good, right? And I do have an ethical issue with that. Um, you know, where the talking with famous people, again, he's just sort of doing it as sort of an academic exercise more than anything. He'll tell you what he thinks your type is with some degree of certainty, um, but he's not there telling you, okay, well, here's the 5 things you need to work on now that we've discovered your type, right? It's sort of a take it or leave it kind of approach. And so I would, I'd be careful about, relying too much on the self-help types out there. Um, you do sort of give it a grifter kind of vibe from some people. And, again, I just sort of have ethical slash intellectual issues with that. Okay. But like I said, I do think it does tie in to my previous video about what are you trying to get out of all this typology stuff, right? Are you do you think that it can help you in some sort of entrepreneurial way, like, being able to figure out a better algorithm for, people who are using your platform, or, marketing materials, that kind of stuff, or just interacting with people that you have to work with around the office, that kind of stuff. Can you apply it in a particular way? Are you just interested? It's just, again, sort of like learning about the Roman Empire. There's really no applied use for it, that you're looking for, but it's just fun to talk about, fun to interact with people, fun thing to think about. That's fine too. Or if you're using it for sort of a self-help, self-actualization. And that again is where you get a little, I don't know, you get a little hesitant on it. Because I and I'm gonna go off track here a little and get a little somewhat political, I guess. But I do think that, especially with sort of the younger generation, like in their 20s or something, that there tends to be this belief that like everybody seems to think there's something wrong with them, right? Like that they've got ADD or they've got autism or they have a mix of both or they're anxious or whatever, and they just keep looking for these sort of self-help people. And yeah, I mean, every generation we had that, but not at this level. And I think there's a lot of people who just sort of grift on that and take advantage of it. And I don't like it. Um, and the other thing is, if you're in your 20s, you're still developing, right? And there is a reason, and don't take this as like behavioral therapy or anything, like just this is my personal opinion. Please don't use it for anything. Um, but if you're in your 20s and you know, especially if you're female, I mean, being depressed and being anxious is just all part of being in your 20s. Because you are in prime childbearing age, and your brain wants you to be anxious, and it wants you to be aware of dangers. And it's better to think that something's a danger that's not a danger. Was that a type 1 error versus the other type of error where you um, don't think something's a danger when it is, right? And so when you're in that stage of development, your brain is just sort of hardwired to become more anxious because chances are, just evolutionarily speaking, you are going to most likely have children around that age. And, to protect your children, you have to be overly anxious a lot of times. Um, and, there's probably a similar argument to be made for, being depressed. To me, I think a large part of depression is the conservation of energy, um, where your brain and your body are sort of preserving energy for other uses. Like, for example, if you're in that part of your life where you're most likely going to be reproducing, your body might start dedicating more energy resources to, that part of your biology. And maybe that's taking something away from your brain, right? Energy that you otherwise would have dedicated to your brain or something like that, right? I mean, we can come up with all kinds of examples, right? But my overall point is that, you know, everybody goes through these developmental stages, and being anxious, being depressed is a very big part of it. And sometimes, I mean, you have to just sort of take what Jungian psychologists view as sort of, instead of being in the valley, right? If you think of all of your problems as sort of a fog down at the bottom of a valley, you want to be up towards the top of the hill or the top of the mountain, looking down on your problems, looking down on the fog, as opposed to being immersed in them constantly. You want to look at them from sort of objective outsider view and understand, like, okay, I've got these problems, I've got these issues, but they don't necessarily have to, control everything, right? Now that being said, I mean, if you do have depression, if you do have anxiety, that doesn't mean, don't go get therapy, as you think it's warranted, but just understand that, there might be a biological reason why you're going through this. And a lot of times the way to get out of it is to just keep going, right? And eventually you hit a new sort of biological stage of development. In over your lifespan. So take that for what it's worth. I'm not trying to be a self-help guru. It's more of a criticism of people who sort of take I don't really say take advantage, but you know um are out there sort of trying to convince everybody that that there's sort of a simple five-step problem to reaching self-actualization or whatever, when really it's just living your life. And getting, and I mean, you're always going to have something going on, but eventually you just sort of go through your life development and you get there. So anyways, that was a very long ramble, but it is sort of my thought on sort of the application of all this stuff. And but if it helps you, go for it. I'm not here to tell anybody that, to not do what you want with it. Um, okay. I don't There might be some other, I mean, there's obviously the socionics model. World Socionics Society seems to be sort of the forefront. I don't know if they have any sort of official, representation or anything, or of socionics as a whole. But, again, that I tend to agree with socionics in the same way that I tend to agree with talking with famous people. He also uses, roughly the socionics sort of approach to things, especially, um, where the different functions, how the different functions act in different types depending on where they are in your stack. He doesn't get into like the blocks and all that kind of stuff, ego versus superego. I think I could be wrong, but I think socionics tends to think of your, secondary functions or your backstack functions or your shadow functions as unconscious versus conscious. And I don't agree with that at all. I think, I mean, just if you just think about it, if somebody's got extroverted SE and, as a unconscious function, does that mean they're unconscious to all the external stimuli? No. Does it mean they're unconscious when they're sort of wielding power into the world? I don't think so. But what I do think is that, it takes a lot of more energy, a lot more attentional resource to use those functions. Maybe every once in a while they sort of bubble up and they don't really reach the level of consciousness, but they're sort of operating in the background and sort of making you frustrated or something. And there could be something to that. Yeah. I mean, there could be, if you're that they could be firing on some sort of unconscious level that you're not aware of and you don't have control over. But I think if you are engaging in SE, even if it's on your backstack, or if you're engaging in FE, even if it's in your backstack, you are bringing it up to consciousness, just in the same way you are with any other function. It just is harder for you to do that. Okay. So that's really my take on the models. I think I've gone on too far. I probably upset a lot of people on my take on depression and anxiety and stuff, but hang in there, you'll be fine. And it's not that I don't take it seriously. I do take it seriously. I just think that there are people out there who sort of capitalize on it, and I've got an issue with that. Okay. Feel free to leave any comments. Okay. I like the way you talk about unconscious, conscious. That makes sense to me. Yeah. So this commenter is, I guess, just patting me on the back for my take on conscious versus unconscious. And yeah, I mean, that stuff is very hard. I mean, and anybody who tells you that they know what they're talking about doesn't. But consciousness, again, all these cognitive functions are conscious functions. They are things that we have to use our consciousness in order to use them in a controlled way. Now, could you have TE sort of bubbling in the background in your unconscious? Maybe, just like any other function, right? There is a lot that we do on an unconscious level. And not only that, but there could be things like SE things, like if you're, the first time you drive a car, you're going to be engaging in a lot of SE, like, ooh, what am I doing here? Where are all the buttons, and where are the mirrors, and where's the steering wheel, and where am I going, and how much do I press versus not press on the brake or the accelerator? All that kind of stuff. You're consciously thinking of your body and the world, interacting with the world. But after you've been driving, for a few years, you do it totally unconsciously. Now, my argument would be that you're no longer using SE for that. Like, it's become an automated process somewhere out in the sort of subcortical areas of your brain, where you don't need to bring it up to consciousness to do it. And it could be even the same thing with just like using FE. Like, for those of us who have FE front stack and we use it quite a bit, we might just do things unconsciously that other people have to think about, right? So in some respects, things that, are functions like on your front stack that you use a lot, you might actually be using those more unconsciously than other functions. But when I talk about consciousness and cognitive functions and all that, really what I'm talking about is, okay, your brain is presented with, usually it's a new problem with new information, and you got to figure out, what do I do? Right? Like, either, how do I engage with this person? How do I engage with this process or this machine? How do I coordinate my body and my senses to sort of interact with the world? How do I explain this thought, and get it out there in a way that's intelligible for people to understand? All that extroverted stuff, you got to consciously sort of think about it and get it out there. Um, and then all the introverted stuff, like, oh my God, here's a new animal that I've never seen before. How do I categorize that thing in my TI? Or here's a new song from a new band. What do I think about it? Where do I put it in my FI sort of evaluation of the world? Sorry, I almost knocked over a cup there. And I would argue you're doing that, consciously, right? When it's new information, new situation, something new to think about. Okay, so going into a different area here, but here we go. Okay, I think that's really about it. Sorry, I messed with your file. No problem at all. That's what we're here for. I'm actually hoping more people sort of start engaging with these live streams. So if you catch me on a live stream, pop in. I'd like to, engage more, do some more FE stuff, and some NE stuff, and yeah. So rather than like 50 minutes of me just rambling to myself. Okay. I think that's about it. Take care. Have a great night, and we'll talk to you next time.